Okay, so we're on to our next topic, which is motivation. And I think something important to keep in mind about motivation is it is really about what moves us towards things. Sometimes it's like moving away from consequences, let's say, but oftentimes it's about moving towards something that we want to engage in. And I think there's this thought in the fitness industry that's put out there quite often where there's this idea that in order to achieve change and become this like very healthy or very fit person or uh, something along those lines, that these individuals that are able to achieve this just have some innate large capacity and skill and quality about them that just has huge amounts of or high levels of motivation, and it's just like constantly motivated, and they just must have willpower that's like unmatched, and I think that's really too bad, because I feel that when there's that prevalence of this idea or this thought out there about motivation and about willpower, um, that's just very misleading. And we'll kind of come up against this idea again later when we get into our discussion about habits. But if you think about elite athletes or people that some individuals might consider just very fit or very healthy, um, you'll notice that a lot of these people, if you were to ask them, well, what motivates you to get up in the morning really early every day and do your exercise or get your exercise in, or how do you find that willpower to like eat right all the time, and questions like that, and those individuals' responses typically will be, I don't really think about it. I don't really have to engage in much willpower to overcome some huge feeling to not do these things and do something else. There is no, very rarely, the need and demand for high amounts of cognitive energy to go into motivating oneself to do something. You just do it. You just do these things. These healthy individuals just in are at a point where, as we spoke about before, they've met termination on certain habits or behaviors, and they just don't need to invest any more energy. So I think just to kind of summarize that a bit into a bit more of a cohesive point is that when you're talking about willpower, which is the capacity to resist engaging in a less good behavior to engage in a better one, or motivation, which is again that draw or that kind of drive towards a behavior that you want to do, usually requiring some willpower. Both of these things initially need larger investments at the start. Okay, when you're beginning to make your changes, when you're beginning to invest time to plan to do an activity, once you're at the action stage of our six stages of change, that takes some willpower at times, and that takes motivation to engage in these behaviors, right? And so what we'll get to do here is we'll look at a couple of different ideas behind motivation, a couple of concepts and models, to kind of see exactly what that is that drives people to do certain things and become self-motivated and ultimately be able to make changes that they want to. Okay. So before we kind of get into our action stage or even like our preparation stage of our stages of change models, we usually need to build some motivation. And the way I like looking at this is, kind of in reference to inertia. Inertia is something wants to stay at rest or in the state it is unless you act on it by an external force, or if we're thinking about behaviors, you get some sort of motivation to move out of that state and engage into a new state or a new action and behavior. Okay, this is kind of a physics principle applied to motivation, but I think it applies. So when we're trying to build this motivation to prepare and engage in a new behavior, a lot of us go through a cognitive process of examining the pros and cons to change. And so that might sound a little funny to you, where you're like, okay, the pros of change, I get that. I want to get better, I want to get healthier. But if I'm choosing to engage in a more healthy behavior, where's the cons? Where's the downside to this? And I always thought that was a little interesting to consider at first as well. But really, there's this a certain level of fear with change, always. Change is unknown. Change brings us to a place that we aren't familiar with, typically, right? And it's in those times where things such as trying to imagine what our lives would be like at that point in time can be scary. Again, because it's unknown. So, for example, if I've had some clients like this before where, and maybe they wouldn't initially kind of identify this, but eventually they do, where they have this underlying fear that, okay, if I become a healthy person, and again, this is kind of an interesting concept to me, but if I become more fit, or if I become someone who eats healthier, or if I become someone who makes health and wellness a priority in my life, what's going to happen to my friends and family? Like, am I still going to be able to be friends with the people I'm friends with? Will I still be able to engage in my favorite hobbies that I like to do? Or does becoming this new, healthier, fit person mean that I have to abandon these things? Or what if my friends who aren't into health and wellness and maybe engage in other activities that are a bit more sedentary, or not the best, let's say, engaging in the best nutritional practices, or maybe they drink a lot or something like that, and you're wanting to change that? What happens then? And so that's scary, like, I have this friends group, I really like them. Do I have to like get rid of them, or will they get rid of me? That's a pretty big thing. So again, these unknowns kind of crop up and add fear into change for people. And I think the other aspect of that too, a downside, is when you go to try to achieve something or make change, that opens you up to failure. What if I try something and I don't succeed? And so we'll talk about a growth and fixed mindset a little bit later. But again, that perception of, for some people, that when they go to try something and fail, that means they themselves as a person become a failure, versus, saying, oh, well, I tried something, it didn't work out. What if I try it this way next time and make some changes and learn from that last attempt and do better next time? So there's a couple of different perspectives there. But for some people, again, a downside to changing means putting yourself out there. You become vulnerable to the potential of failure. Okay? So maybe I've done this cognitive dance or whatever. I come to the point, I'm like, okay, well, there's more pros. I understand the cons, and that's like largely to do with like fear of failure and like a fear of the unknown, but let's go for it. Kind of the next step, or another component as I'm building up this momentum, is I need to increase my self-efficacy. And so that's a little bit different than self-esteem. And here is the difference. So when you're talking about self-esteem, that's a bit more of a like global, broader concept of a belief that when you go to attempt things, you are most likely going to be okay. You have the capacity to try something. You have the capacity and skill set to do things in life. So again, this is just very broad, very general. If we were to speak now more directly to self-efficacy, when we're efficacious or have self-efficacy, it's more specific to a certain area of our life. So an example of this might be, I feel like I'm very capable and have a lot of skill set and am knowledgeable enough in my schooling or academic work, okay? But I don't feel really capable or like have enough skills or abilities or knowledge to be able to successfully go mountaineering and climb Mount Everest. Okay, so again, it can be very area dependent. We'll have different levels and feelings of self-efficacy towards work, friendships, more like partnerships. Again, pretty much any realm that you can kind of think of: physical activity, nutrition, etc. Okay, so before we get, or part of our motivation comes from this belief that we're capable. Okay, and then last but not least is a bit more of a logistic thing, where we need to identify barriers and challenges initially, and that's part of our pros and cons process too. We think, oh, okay, well, what is stopping me from doing these things, and being able to at least plan ahead to try to overcome them is important. When we come up against barriers and challenges, and it always happens in life, that can sometimes have a bit of a demotivating effect. And so typically it's what you do after, or what your clients do after they hit this barrier, that becomes more or the most important kind of facet of that. Okay, and I think in and around this time, there are people that are work as like motivational coaches, but I also feel that's just as a movement practitioner, physio, whomever, that it's really up to you to help engage in these activities and help your clients or students out, or patients kind of recognize some of this in the larger lifestyle management process, for sure. Okay. Let's say, for example, now you're working with someone and you see that they're looking at some pros and cons. They're trying to identify these barriers, and they seem to have pretty good self-efficacy in this certain area that they're hoping to change. And then the next thing that you can do, or for yourselves, is recognize what's appealing to this activity. So again, to kind of help build your motivation, or at least recognize what draws you towards an activity. In particular, I'm thinking I have like fitness or exercise in mind, but you can really look at a number of different metrics or dimensions of wellness on this. Is what are the different areas of motivation? How can I categorize where my motivation is coming from? And I've found that the 4 S's of motivation is really good. I've came across this when I was taking a NCCP, or National Coaching Certification Program course in triathlon, actually, to become a coach for that. So it expands to I think a lot of motivation for a lot of engagement in different areas of life. So we kind of have these 4 S's: success, social, skill mastery, and sensation. Okay, and so I'll look at this in a physical activity kind of context, but there's definitely other areas you can look at it. So if I engage in physical activity, or in particular sport, let's say, one of the things that motivates myself potentially could be success or achievement. Okay, so I like either going out and achieving, let's say getting on the podium and getting a medal, or finishing a race and getting a participant medal. Okay, so these are like achievement kind of based rewards that I get, and that motivates me to get outside, when it's less than ideal conditions, or I'm feeling maybe not as engaged in life, but maybe in this particular area, such as sport, I think back, I'm like, oh yeah, I really want to perform well. I want to succeed and achieve a certain level of achievement in my next race. I got to get out there and train if I want to do that. So that can be very motivating. The other part to sport is social. So there's a few different ways this can crop up, but whether it's like social on a team, or social at races, or maybe it's just social interactions you have with others, talking about sport after you do it, or whatever the case is. So that kind of social aspect is what people enjoy. The friendships you make, that side of things. Skill mastery, I think, is similar to success, but it's more focused on just achieving and getting good at something for the sake of getting good at it. Here, I think a lot of us can relate to this. We probably have had a lot of skills or something that we felt engaged in, and we like that feeling of progression. In fact, just as one example, video games try to gamify the reward systems by giving a sense of skill mastery. So, for example, and there's a few mechanisms going on here, but you start off playing a game, and very early on, there's lots of little rewards as far as being able to play at a slightly higher and higher, more challenging levels, right? So you kind of get this early on reward system. It gets more and more challenging as you go along, but as we work through that, let's say skill progression in whatever development that happens to be, we feel better and better. I think going back to sport, as we become more and more proficient at our skill, we feel better about ourselves, and that's really motivating. And then the last point here is sensation. Just the sensory of moving our bodies and engaging in sport gives us perceptually and just like physically a lot of different sensations. And for some people, that's really motivating. That's really engaging. I know for myself, to use sport as an example, I like this example point where, riding bikes and, climbing up a hill is like really hard, even in and of that self, like I kind of like that heavy breathing, feel your heart beating. You're kind of challenging yourself and pushing. That can be related to a good sensation. But even, for example, on the way down the hill, when you're, it's kind of tucked in to like minimize draft from the wind, and it's a fairly big slope, it's safe. It's something like Cypress Mountain. And you're coming down the road and you're going like 75 kilometers an hour on a bike, and you're heading downhill and the wind's blowing past you and you're taking some corners quickly, and it's fun. The sensory feedback that you get from that is really engaging. Okay, so that's our 4 S's of motivation. And again, identifying which of these, like if you want to practically apply this, I think is really important and fun, is we can kind of take each of these and see where our clients might be motivated from, or for ourselves. It's good to recognize this because, let's say again, when we're trying to build motivation early on, or when we're in this action stage of the stages of change, we can really try to lean into the things that we know motivates us when other aspects of what we need to do as far as building our new behavior is less engaging. Okay. We have one more model that we'll look at that I think a little deeper kind of explains these categories. So these are like categories we can group people in, but I think the self-determination theory really explains more of why those things might be motivating for each of us. And this can be a standalone and be applied as well. But more or less what this theory says is people, in order to feel motivated towards something, need autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And there's been a video that's floated out there a few times. I think it's Dan Pink, but he kind of has a spin on this. It's like a bit of an animated YouTube video. I'll try to find it and post it, but essentially he speaks to just like motivation or engagement in anything. I think the context might be work, but there's this thought where to be motivated, let's say in a work kind of setting, there's this old idea of carrot and stick, right? Reward and punishment. And historically, when a lot of work and research in behind this was done in a factory where, the quicker you press a button or the faster you pull a lever, the more production you have. And so to motivate that, yes, in this scenario, it does help to reward the more button clicks you make or the more levers you pull in a certain amount of time, you get paid more. So that's the carrot, right? And, the fear or potential of losing a job is the stick, maybe in this scenario. But for a lot of today's work, that isn't just physically being productive, you need some sort of level of internal motivation and engagement. And so these principles are really, really important. And so again, if we're thinking about wellness and being able to decide for ourselves how to get motivated and engage in good wellness, autonomy, competence, and relatedness is really important. And so we can give slightly different terms to this that relates to things that we've covered already and we'll cover later. So autonomy is just my capacity or belief that I can choose what I engage in, and that what I choose to engage in aligns with what I like to do and my value system. Okay, so that's kind of the one. Competence is, again, going back to that self-efficacy a little bit. So do I have the knowledge and the skills necessary to engage in this activity? And I think on some levels of research, you can also tie in skill mastery there. So people feel very engaged in, hey, maybe I don't have all the necessary skills and capacity now, but as long as I feel like I can build up on it, and this is where something like a growth mindset helps, as long as I can build my skill in this area and I feel I have some capacity to do that, that's going to be very motivating as well. So again, competence and skill mastery, similar to what we spoke about on last slide. And the last point, and research sometimes has been mixed on here, but relatedness. So when you have social connections or support, that's supposed to be really motivating. And what I mean, some of the research is mixed on this is, yes, having a support network is really, really important. And yes, having a group of people around you that are like-minded or similarly motivated or engaged in the same thing is definitely motivating and encouraging and needed for continued engagement in, say, something like wellness. But the one caveat is just this popular idea that goes out as far as goal setting, that when you set a goal, it's really, really important to tell somebody. And research is just a little mixed on that. So, yeah. But again, these 3 points are really motivating when we are trying to self-direct ourselves into activity, which as adults, this model definitely applies. Okay, great. So next up, let's talk about goals and goal setting. Okay, there's a couple of really important points that we can pull in once we're nice and motivated, how to engage into goal setting. Okay, and that'll be on the next video. We'll see you there.